Merry belated Christmas from me, Justin, here at Blender Frenzy. I wanted to get this tutorial out before Christmas, but as it goes, I do this part-time, so I'm trying to get this in between life and jobs and everything. So this is the first video of two videos that I will show you how to create a Christmas motion graphic scene, but it doesn't have to be limited to Christmas. Everything that I teach you in these two videos you can use for any sort of motion graphic scene. So we'll cover gradients, we'll cover text, how to add downloaded images, how to create your own shapes using Blender's VSE, and none of it's 3D, it's all 2D. So if you're not familiar with 3D work, this is perfect for you. So in this video, we'll learn how to add all of this stuff to your scene, and then in the second video, we'll learn how to animate it. So let's go ahead and get started. So open up a new instance of Blender, go to File, New, Video Editing. Let's collapse the file browser by hovering over the preview area in the top left corner where you see the crosshairs. Click and drag over to the left and let go. You can see my screencast keys right here. And the first thing I'm going to do is go to View and uncheck Limit View to Contents, so then I can middle mouse and drag around the timeline a little bit more freely. Next, we can come to Add, choose Color, and then we can click and drag and bring that up. And then if I press period on the numpad, I can zoom in to whatever I have selected. So make sure you have your color strip selected, and then come over to your side panel. If you don't see the side panel, press N on the keyboard, and then you'll find your color wheel you can adjust. You should also make sure you're on the strip tab at the top. That's where you'll find the color wheel. And I'm just going to make this a bright red color. Next, I'm going to duplicate the color strip by pressing Shift D and put it right on top, and then we'll bring the value of this color down. The preview is now showing the darker strip because the darker strip is on the highest channel. If you imagine a camera looking from these timeline numbers downwards, then the topmost strip is the top layer, and it will look down through anything that is on the next channel or has transparency. It will see through that to the next channel below. So if I move the top strip, you can see where the blue timeline cursor is, it now is showing the bright red strip on the channel below. So I'm just going to move that back. And so now let's go to the rendering workspace up here, and I'm going to right click and duplicate this and then rename it by double clicking, and then I'll type masking. Then change this option from view to mask. And then the first thing I'm going to do is come over to output properties, go all the way down to the bottom, open up post-processing, and make sure sequencer is checked. I'm also going to uncheck compositing because we're not using that right now. And then I'm going to hover my mouse over here and press F12, and that will render out a single frame. Now come to the top and press New to create a new mask, and I'm going to call this mask background because we're going to use a mask to make the gradient. So first I'm going to move the 2D cursor from down here in the corner into the middle. So come over here to the View tab, and then under 2D cursor I'm going to change the location of the X and the Y to 0.5. And now it's right in the center of our resolution. So let's now come up to Add and then choose Square. And then let's select the top two by shift selecting, press X to delete, and delete the top two. And then I'm going to press A to select the rest of them, press S to scale, and scale that all the way across. I'm going to bring this down to the bottom by pressing G and then Y. And then to make the gradient, we just scale the feather of the mask. And you do that by pressing Alt S. And you can see we've got this weird look and shape, which is not what we want. So to fix this, come up to the Mask tab and then uncheck Cyclic. And now the feather line is the green line that is coming out that is parallel to our white mask line. So I'm going to press Alt S again, scale that to a certain point here. That looks good. And to see what this is doing, we can come up to Mask Display and then choose Overlay. And now you can see the feather is this gradient here. And we can change the fall off by coming to this drop down and choosing different fall off types. We can also turn the mask curves off by coming back up to Mask Display and unchecking Spline, or we can just uncheck this button under the mask layers. So we can kind of see what each of these does, choose the one that you like the best. But when you're working with gradients and feathers in Blender, just be aware that it can produce some banding, which are these solid lines that seem to be going across our image, and that's just each of them gradually getting darker. That's what creates your gradient. But this all depends on the color bits that you're using and the computer screen that you're using. So this is going to be different for everyone. So you have to do your own tweaking to reduce the amount of banding that you see. Okay, so now let's go use this. So go back to video editing, select the top color, go to modifiers, add strip modifier, mask, click mask, and then choose our mask background. And now you can see how the gradient looks. All of the white areas are going to show the darker background, and as it fades out into black, that's where the darker background will be invisible. And that's why you can see the darker color at the bottom, because that's where the majority of the white part of the mask is. And we can actually see this in the masking workspace. If we uncheck our overlay and then press F12, then we can see the result of the mask. So if we change the fall off to something different, so smooth, and then press F12, then we can see what the smooth fall off looks like with our colors. And I like the smooth fall off a little better, so I'm going to keep that. So let's come back to our video editing workspace, and then let's refresh just to make sure. So we can come to view and then refresh all, which is also Control R. So now I'm going to select the bottom color strip, come over to the strip tab, and then bring the value down just a little bit, something like that. And then go back to the rendering, press F12, and that's looking pretty good. So that is how you create a gradient from one color to another color in Blender's video sequence editor. Okay, so we have our gradient. Now let's add some text. So I can either come up to add and then text, or if I hover my mouse over the sequencer, I can press Shift A and then add text. And then G to grab and then Y to constrain it up and down so it doesn't move left and right. So just like with the color strips, you'll find that all the text properties and options over here on the side. If you don't see this area, again, make sure you press N on the keyboard. But this area is a little bit too small, and you can see if I scroll down through it, there are lots of options. So let's fix this so we can see it a little bit better. So I'm going to come up here to the corner of this section, which is the properties. And when you see those crosshairs, click and drag and pull down. And it will cut across into the sequencer, creating space for itself. Now, cutting across other areas like this is a newer feature in Blender. Currently, I'm using version 3.3.2. I don't exactly remember when it was implemented, but this is the version I'm using. So next, let's hover our mouse over in the corner again and click and drag up to duplicate this area. And then we'll change this area with this icon and then choose Video Sequencer. Let's close the channels portion and then open up the properties over on the right. You may also have to adjust the width of this area by clicking and dragging where you see the double arrows and pull this out. And now you can see the same sequencer properties that we have over here, just in a bigger area. So if I hover my mouse over the sequencer, I can press N to collapse that, and now we have a little bit more room to work with. So make sure you're on the strip tab, and we can look at all these options. The first one, of course, is the text, where I can write Merry Christmas. We have the font, which I'll get to a little bit later. Click and drag and adjust the size. We can adjust the color. We have the shadow, which we can check on and change the color and the opacity. We can also put it in a box and change the box margin, and we can also change the box color and all that good stuff. But I'm going to uncheck all of those for now. And then we have the location of the text. And let's see what this is doing. If we come up here and turn on the overlays with this button, you'll see the origin right in the center of the text. And if I move the layout location, you can see the text moving, but the origin and the text strip container doesn't move. And this is in contrast to moving the entire container along with the origin. So if you come down to transform and you change these positions, you see that you're actually moving the entire container and text with it. And the same thing with the Y position of just the text versus the entire container. So that's how that works. I'm just going to put these back at 0.5, which is directly in the center. And then we got the anchor, which is our justification. So we got left justification, center, or right justified. And same thing with the Y. We have the top, the bottom, and the center alignment. And then back down here we have our scale and our rotation. And we can also move the origin by itself. And so now the container is not moving, but the origin is. And the origin will affect the rotation. So if the origin is in the center, it rotates around the center. But if I move the origin somewhere else, then you can see the effect that the rotation has on that. You can also move things in the preview window with Blender's regular transform options. If you press G, you can grab and move, S to scale, and R to rotate. and that's just the same as moving these sliders over here. I'm going to put the origin back to 0.5, and if I come up over here to the left, I can open these tools up, and if I hold this button here, I can choose between tweak and select box. So select box is just what it says. You just click and drag, and you drag a box to select. But if I change it to tweak, I can just click and drag whatever I have selected straight away. And you can see the text on top in the preview because it's on the top channel of all of our strips, which means it's in the top layer of the preview. And if you move and scale and rotate anything, and you want to get it back to its original position, it's very easy. Alt-R will clear the rotation, Alt-S will clear the scale, and Alt-G will clear the location. So let's scroll back up here and look at the wrap width. If I adjust this and I pull this down, you can see that Merry Christmas now is wrapped. So it's as if you have these imaginary borders on the sides that are squeezing in, and now the text has to wrap around in order to fit. Now this only works with words. It doesn't break up the words in individual letters. This is more obvious if we add more text. So if we add "and a Happy New Year," you can see how this is wrapping around. And if we adjust the wrap width, the larger the wrap width is, the more room that the sentence has to display itself and will be on one line longer before it wraps. But there is a really big limitation with this wrap width, and that is you don't have the option to align this. So even though we have our anchor points at center, it's still aligning the text like it's left justified. And you can't change that. There's no option to change that. We have to break this up into different text strips. And so I'm going to delete our extra text, go back to Merry Christmas, and then I'm going to take the text and duplicate it. And for the top one, I'm going to keep Merry, and for the bottom one, I'm going to keep Christmas. And then I'm going to take the Christmas text, and I can either move the layout location of just the text, or instead, what I'm going to do is hover my mouse over the preview, press G and then Y to constrain it up and down, and just move it down a little bit. If I press X, it will constrain it left and right, but I'm going to press Y and move it down just a little bit. So if I wanted to add a Happy New Year, I could duplicate these two, and then I can select both of these here, G and then Y to grab and move them down. And now I can select Merry here and then choose the anchor as left justified, so it aligns it to where the origin is now left of the text. And so now I can do it to the rest of these, but instead of doing them one at a time, I can do all of them by shift selecting all of them and then selecting Merry last. And you can see all of them are selected, but Merry is the one that's active. And you can tell because the selected ones are in an orange outline, while the active one is in a white outline. And the active selection is what you see over here in the properties. So you can see the text says Merry, but if I press and hold Shift and select Christmas, you can now see the Christmas strip is active, and you see Christmas over here in the options. So let's go back to Merry, because we want to use these settings to apply to the rest of them. So with the anchor on left, I can right click and then choose copy to selected. And we now have all of them having the anchor on the X as left, or in other words, left alignment or left justified. I can do the same thing if I do right justified, just changed Merry, and then right click, copy to selected. And now they're all right justified. And then to center text, we can choose center and right click, copy to selected. And now they're all centered. Now let's just say all of these are in a different location. If they're all over the place in different locations, we can still choose to center all of them above or below anything that we choose. But remember, if we move the whole container, we have to use these options down here. But if we just move the text, we have to use the layout of the text location over here. And so if we choose Christmas as what we want everything centered to, make sure Christmas is active, and we're going to use the X position because X is left and right. So now we can click and drag a box over all four of these strips. And since Christmas is the active one, we can come over to the X position, right click, and choose copy to selected. Now all of them are centered on the x-axis, and all we have to do is click each of them and press G and then Y to move them up and down on the y-axis, just like that. And then we can select all of them and then move them over to wherever we want. But for our Christmas card, we don't need "and a Happy New Year," so we're going to get rid of these two strips. So let's go back to the original positions with Alt-G, and then grab Christmas and move it down a little bit. So now let's talk a little bit about the font. So right now I don't have any fonts opened yet, but before we click on Open, let's come up to Edit, Preferences, click on File Paths, and up at the top where it says Fonts, this is where you want to put in the path to your fonts, whatever system you're using. And once you've done that, you can come over and click Open, and then it will load the fonts, and you can see them in the thumbnails. If you don't see the thumbnails, you can click this button here, but you can also display them as a list or details. You can also change the size of the thumbnails. Medium works for me right now. And I'm just going to look for something like this. This one looks good. So if I hover my mouse over the preview, press S to scale, you can see this doesn't work very well because it gets blurry really quickly, and the resolution isn't very good. So whenever you're scaling text in the VSE, you want to actually use the text size option, because that's going to keep it nice and crisp. So I'm going to scale it to something about here. Okay, let's select Mary now and open a new text. And I'm going to choose, this one looks good. Let's also resize this a little bit. 95 looks good. I'm actually going to grab and move it. So with text, what I like to do is scale with the size option in the properties and move it with the container in the preview. So I'm going to move it somewhere like this. Okay, so that is the font. Now let's do the drop shadow. Of course, we have an option that says shadow, so if we click it, we can see we do have a drop shadow. However, it's very limited. The problem is we don't have any option to move it. We don't have any option to blur it. We do have option to change its color and opacity. That's about it. So instead, let's make our own drop shadow manually. So to do this, let's move the text Mary up a couple of channels, and then I'm going to duplicate Christmas up one. And then I'm going to hide the top Christmas, and the bottom one will change this color to a black for the shadow. And actually going to move them up a little bit more because we do need another space to add our blur. So with the bottom Christmas text, I'm going to select that, press Shift A, go to Effects Strip, and choose Gaussian Blur. Now the Gaussian Blur and the text Christmas are using the same exact information. And you can tell by Shift right clicking on any strip. If you Shift and right click, you'll isolate that strip and everything else will be hidden. So let's select our Gaussian blur and actually blur it by going to the properties, and under effect strip we can choose the size, and I'm going to type in 20. And if I scroll in here, you can see that it kind of looks like it's blurring, but we still have this crisp edge around the Christmas text. And the reason is for what I just said. We still have text Christmas that is showing through from underneath. If you shift and right click our Gaussian blur, we can see that that's just the blur. If you shift and right click our text Christmas, you can see the crisp text Christmas. So all we have to do is just hide the bottom text Christmas, and that just leaves us with the blur. And then the top text Christmas, which is still our white text, we're going to unhide that. And now you can see our drop shadow of the blur beneath that. And now we have complete control over the Gaussian blur in a lot of different ways. So we can grab it and move it. And the further we move it from the original text, the more it looks like the text is popping out or sticking out above the background. We can also adjust the blur, making this a little bit more. So if I type in 50 instead, you can see that's very soft blur. The higher it goes, and then the lower it goes, the more crisp of a blur that we have. So I'm going to put this back to 20 and show you another trick. If I take the Gaussian blur and the text Christmas and I put them into a meta strip, it's going to group them together, and I'm going to rename this to Meta Christmas Shadow. And now we have an option down here of color. And if I open this up and adjust the multiply option, you can see it actually grows or shrinks the shadow, making it more or less prominent. And we can also adjust the opacity overall. So we can pull that down and make it more see-through. So everything we're doing is so much more versatile than the standard drop shadow that comes with Blender. Okay, so let's do the same thing here with Mary. Just going to do the same thing, duplicating the text, adding the blur, hiding the black text for the blur. But here's a tip when you're doing these kinds of things And you're actually trying to match. So if we want to match the shadows for both of the texts, and not just shadows, but any sort of effect that we might want to do to them, it's best to make sure all of the origins and text are centered in the middle of the resolution. So I'm going to go ahead and do that by clicking in all of these places and pressing Alt G to make everything in the center. So now we have something like this. Of course, everything's now overlapping, but that's okay. We can work on them one at a time. I'm going to hide Christmas and then put the blur shadow in a meta strip, just like we did with Christmas, and we're going to title it Meta Mary Shadow. And then from the meta strip, we can decide on all of our options, like the position and the opacity. So then we'll unhide Christmas and then hide Mary. Select the Christmas shadow first and then shift select the Mary shadow. Right click on our location. Do copy to selected on the X and the Y. So it's copying from the Mary shadow to the Christmas shadow. And then we can do the same thing for the multiply. Right click and copy to selected and the opacity. So now the shadows of Mary and Christmas should match each other. So now I'm going to rename everything just to make it a little bit more consistent. So the text Mary, I'm just going to say text underscore Mary, and then text Mary shadow. And then I'm going to rename the blur to blur Mary shadow and do the same thing with Christmas. And then I'm going to take the original text and the shadow and make another meta strip, and then we'll just title this Meta Mary for the Mary text, and then do the same thing for Christmas, Meta Christmas. And now I can take each of the meta strips and readjust them, moving the Mary up and the Christmas down a little bit so that they're both centered. And that way, if I select the meta strip and press Tab, once I enter into it, the text itself is going to be centered right in the middle for us to use any sort of effect or embellishment or shadow or anything. It's just going to be easier this way, having it right in the middle. But when we tab back out, it will still be in the position that we want it in our scene overall. Okay, we've got our text lined up, we've got the font that we want, and we've got a drop shadow. Now let's give the text a little bit of color. And since the text right now is currently a solid white color, it will work perfect as a mask for a color strip. So add in a color strip. I'm going to move it all the way to the top. And you can see that's what the preview sees because it's the top channel. If I bring down the opacity, you can see what's underneath it. So let's go to the modifiers tab, add strip modifier mask. And this time we're going to keep the mask input type on strip because we're going to use one of the strips in the sequencer. And we're going to choose Meta Christmas. And once we do that, we can see that the black color is only showing where our white Christmas text is. Now we still have the white text showing through. You can see that on the edges of the text. So all we have to do is hide our Meta Christmas. And now we only have our color strip showing where the Christmas is. The problem is it has removed our shadow, so we can't put it out here. So I'm going to unhide Meta Christmas. We're going to get rid of the color out here. And let's go inside the meta strip for Christmas. We're just going to use the text Christmas as the mask, instead of previously we're using both the text and the shadow combined. So let's add in a color, bring it up. I'm just bringing the color on the top just to demonstrate this. You don't have to have it on the top. It can be wherever, as long as the timeline cursor can see it. So let's do the same thing, modifiers, add strip modifier, and choose our strip mask as text Christmas. And to see this better, I'm going to add in a temporary background and change the color to a darker red to kind of emulate what we have out in the main scene. That way we can see our text and drop shadow. And then come back to the color and we can change the color of the text here to any color we want. So this is how you would change the color of any text in Blender's VSE, but we want to make it a little bit more dynamic. We want to have a more of a gradient text to emulate some sort of like shiny gold. So to get started with that, let's duplicate our color up. And for now, I'm going to click this eye icon, which will mute our mask so that we can see what's happening and adjust our colors. So I'm going to change the top color to full white and the bottom color to full black. And in the top color on the Y position, I'm going to type in 1080 divided by 2, which is 540. And this is because my resolution is 1920 by 1080, which makes our display half and half, half black, half white. And I want to combine these together in a meta strip. So what I'm going to do is actually just get rid of those masks from the colors themselves, and then select both of them, make them a meta strip, and rename this meta grad Christmas for the gradient for the Christmas text. And then on the meta strip, I'm going to now add the mask of our text Christmas. And now you can see when I drag the meta strip around, it's showing half and half in the Christmas text. And you can use this for all sorts of cool effects like scaling, rotating, and moving it within the Christmas text. But we're not done here. I want this to be a gradient, and actually don't want to be a gradient with just 2 different colors. I want to use 3 different colors for this. So let's go back into the meta strip. The top color can stay white, but the bottom color I want to be a sort of darker goldish color, something like this. And now if we tab back out, we can see what that looks like. And I'm going to press Alt-G so we can reset that position right back to the center. So the way we're going to do the gradient is very similar to the way we did the gradient for the background. So let's go back to the masking workspace, hover my mouse over in the corner till you see the crosshairs, click and drag and pull out a duplicated area. Change this area to the video sequence editor, and then I'm going to change this from sequencer to sequencer and preview, and then we can see this. Just going to adjust this here to zoom in, but we're going to put the mask on a third color, so let's go back into our gradient for our text. Duplicate the bottom one up onto the top, and I'm going to go back to the video editing workspace so that I can adjust this. Adjust the color. I'm going to put this as a lighter gold color or a lighter yellowish type color. So going back to our masking, let's add a new mask and name it Mask Grad Christmas. And then press F12, which will render out whatever the preview is showing currently. And with our 3D cursor still in the center, we can add our mask. Hover your mouse up over the menu and scroll to reveal more information, and then click add, and then add in our square. This time I'm going to keep the whole square, but just scale it on the x-axis. And since we have this area over here, we can come over and add in our mask from here. Choose Mask Grad Christmas, and now we have the lighter color showing only where our mask is right in the middle. So if we tab out, we can see what effect that's having now. And now we have 3 different colors that are displayed in Christmas. But first we need to resize this, and we'll resize it using the mask. So we're just going to scale it on the y-axis. And then over here, Control R to refresh so we can see the changes. So we can actually adjust the meta strip so it shows a little bit more centered in the text. But to do that, we need to come over to the video editing workspace again. So I'm going to select the meta strip, move it down on the y-axis. So something like that, but we're not quite done because we don't want it to be 3 hard colors. We want it to fade into each other so it looks like this shiny gold. So we've got to feather that middle piece there. So let's go back to our masking. Hover your mouse over your mask area, press A to select everything, and Alt-S to scale that feather. If when you start to scale it goes in instead of out, just come up here to mask and select switch direction. And you can toggle the direction of the feather going inside or out. So I'm going to change that back, scale that up a little bit, and then come over here and Control R to refresh. And now you can kind of see what we're going for. It's starting to work, but we've lost a lot of the bottom color there. So we have to adjust it still. So since we have limited access, because of the way Blender works, the sequencer and preview together, we can't really adjust the preview area. Instead, I'm going to change this just to the preview area. And then I'm going to go to the bottom corner where you see the crosshairs and pull out another area. And we're going to change this to the sequencer. And this is just going to allow us to move things in the preview area. So I'm going to hide the channel names. We don't need to see that. So with our meta strip selected, in the preview area, I'm going to press G to grab and move that up so we can see more of the bottom. But we also want to make sure we get that white shine on the top. And this is probably not going to work with our current setup because our Christmas letters are all different sizes. So we're going to have to add some points to our mask so we can adjust that. So let's press F12 over here again so we can render out what we see in our preview. And if I press and hold Control and left click on our mask, we can start to add points. And with that point selected, I can press V to set the handle type and then choose free. And now this point has handles, I can move around and just adjust things. So I'm just going to do the same thing, adding points and moving the handles to adjust where the white portion of the text comes in, moving them down for the smaller letters and moving them up for the taller letters. So this is looking good, except for we have a little bit of a problem. On the R in Christmas, we see this hard edge line that's looking kind of funky. And the reason this is happening is because that is where our middle line is in our gradient, where the two solid colors are coming into contact with each other, right in the middle. So all we have to do is go into our gradient, take the white color, press G and Y to grab that down, and make sure the bottom edge is covered by the middle lighter color. So we're just adjusting the bottom edge so we don't see that bottom edge. And then we come back out and you can see now we have our gradient covering that solid line so that it blends more nicely into that white. And so I'm just adjusting the points a little bit more, adjusting it to my personal preference. This will be also your personal preference. And that looks good there, I think. So let's go back out all the way. Yep, and that looks pretty good. And we don't have to redo all of our work. We can actually just come back into Meta Christmas, select our Meta gradient, Control C to copy, tab back out. Be careful when you're tabbing in and out of meta strips because if you have one selected, it's just going to tab back and forth, toggling in and out of that one. So in order to get out of nested meta strips, you have to click and make sure nothing is selected, and then you can tab out of the current one you're in. So let's go into our meta Mary and Control V to paste, and we're going to rename this Meta Grad Mary. And let's go inside our gradient, and we're going to be using a different mask for this gradient. So I'm going to keep the mask modifier, but just X out the current mask. Go back to our masking, F12 so we can see what our preview sees, and then add in a new mask and call it Mask Grad Mary. And then Shift A to add in our square mask, scale it on the X like we did before. And now we can come over here to add in our mask on that color strip. But you can see our text is still showing Christmas, and that's because our meta gradient is still pointing to the Christmas text. So all we have to do is change the mask to say text Merry instead of text Christmas. And now we can adjust the positioning of the meta strip here for our gradient. But because Christmas was the bigger font, we're going to have to adjust the size of our mask and gradient here. So let's scale down our mask on the Y, and we can start to see what's going on here, but it's moved it from the center. So G, Y, and we can move that down for our mask, something like that. And let's adjust this. And something else we can do instead of going back and forth adjusting our mask. I think our mask is good for now. So I can also come over here to the preview area and rotate it a little bit to fit that a little bit better. And then instead of continuing to go back and forth with our mask and scaling that, I can actually just scale the metastrip gradient in the preview area. So I'm going to press S and Y to scale it on the Y axis. So just so we can see all three colors in our Mary text. But of course we need our feather, so go back to the mask, Alt S to scale that feather. And then I'm going to come back and scale and adjust the gradient container, the metastrip, until it fits. So something like that. And for this one, I don't think I'm actually going to need to add any more points. I think I like that just the way it is. So let's come back out and see what we have. We now have our Merry Christmas, and our text now looks like a shiny stylized gold text, which is a lot more interesting than just a solid color. I'm also going to adjust the Merry over a little bit so it looks a little bit more centered with the Christmas. And there we go. I like what I see. The next thing we want to do is make it reveal. So we want to make it start invisible and then wipe in as a magical reveal. And this can actually be done very easily without any keyframes whatsoever. The first thing we want to do is add in a color, bring it to the top, Shift D to duplicate that color and bring it over here, somewhere over here, doesn't matter where. I'm going to make the second color over here completely white. And then I'm going to select the black color and then Shift select the white color, press Shift A to add in a transition and choose wipe. And now if the wipe is actually working, it should look something like this. But I don't want it to wipe down, I want it to wipe across. So let's select the wipe. Let's come over to the strip tab and change the angle to 90. And now it's wiping right to left, which is the wrong direction. So let's just change the direction from out to in. And now it's wiping in from left to right. So now let's take all the handles of everything we've made so far, press G to grab, and then hold down Control to snap it to the end handle of the color. Now we want to use this wipe for our text, but instead of adding it to Merry and Christmas, we're going to make yet another meta strip. So we're going to put these two together, select both of them, Control G for a meta strip, and we're going to call this Meta Merry Christmas. And we're going to take our colors and our wipe, we're going to make those into a meta strip as well. Call this Meta Wipe. And then for a Meta Merry Christmas, add in a mask, go to modifiers, add strip modifier, mask, and we're going to choose our Meta Wipe. If you shift and right click on our Merry Christmas, you can see the effect that it's having. Everywhere the white color is, you can see our text, and everywhere the black color is, the text is invisible. But I don't want this hard line, so we can come back to our wipe, select the wipe, and change the blur width to something like 0.5, and then come back out, shift and right click on our Merry Christmas text. You can see it's now wiping across with more of a feathered fade. But of course our mask wipe is in the way, so let's hide that so we can see everything. And now we have our text magically being revealed as Merry Christmas. And you can make the wipe go faster or slower by just taking the end color and pulling it in. So pulling it in, this is shorter, so a shorter time means a faster wipe. And we can see what that looks like. And we can go to 25% so we can see what that looks like in real time. There we go. Or we can make it longer, of course. And this has gone past the meta strip. So you can see here's the end of the meta strip here. I've gone past it. So if I tab out, select the meta strip, Alt O will clear that offset, and then it will make sure everything that's in the meta strip is in the proper frame range. So now we have a slow reveal, just like that. But I'm going to just undo that because I like the way I had it. Just like that. Go back to 100% here and close that. Okay, so now that we have our text completely finished, we need to embellish our card with some images. So Pixabay is a wonderful place to find all sorts of images for your projects. So what I did is just went to look for different images, and so I wanted an image of a cross, so I typed in cross, and then it allows you to choose between different image types, and I chose vector graphics, and then I found this, and then we got a cross, which is the reason for the season, and then we have our poinsettia border or corners. And let me go ahead and shout out the people here. So we've got Art Rose here for the poinsettia, and the cross, it looks like GDJ. And then we also have a yellow star here, FF Basil. And then we have a red and gray star here by Clucker Free Vector Images, I guess. So there you go, shout out. And by the way, each of these are PNG images, which means they have transparency, or they can have transparency. And you can tell the transparency by the checkered background. That usually represents transparency or the part of the image that's invisible. So you can use it as an overlay on top of other images or video. So I've downloaded those already. I'm going to go back to Blender, and we're going to go to the end so that we can see our Merry Christmas text. So we can come up to add an image and just navigate to the folder you saved your images in, and then I'll double click on the cross and add that in. And you can't see it right now because it's on the bottom channel, so G to grab and move that up. Click and drag, or press G and S to scale and just put it where I want. It's actually pretty simple. I'm also going to add in the other image of the poinsettia corners and pull that up to the top. And you can see it doesn't quite stretch to the sides of our resolution. And it also looks like I've moved the background here a little bit. So I'm just going to go select the backgrounds here, do Alt G to make sure everything is centered. There we go, that's better. And then for our poinsettia, we just want to scale on the X. So press S and then X to scale only on the X-axis. And then I'm going to zoom in here, make sure we get it all the way to the edge. All right, perfect. And what we can do with the cross to make sure it's centered vertically, I can take the Y position and just type in 0. So that's right in the center vertically. And actually that looks pretty good like that, so I'm going to leave it just like that. So now I'm going to add in our yellow star. And it actually matches the color pretty nicely as far as the gold. But I want to show you how you can easily change the color to match it a little bit better to whatever project you're working with. So with it selected, go to the modifiers tab. And if we add strip modifier, we can do a color balance. And you can adjust the colors here. You can adjust the value and the colors to sort of match the highlights and the shadows just like that, and that matches a little bit better to what we have. You can make it a little bit more yellow, you can make it brighter or darker, but this may be a little bit too much gold. So if you want to actually change the color completely, we can actually add in a hue correct. And so in here we want to click hue because the HSV stands for hue, saturation, and value. So we click the H for hue, and anywhere there is yellow, we can bring the yellow point up and down, and that will actually start to change the color of whatever is yellow in our selection. And it's not all that apparent, so you have to kind of mess around with it to see which colors are where. But I want to try to find a red color because I want to change this to more of a red star. And so something like this. So that's a little bit more of a reddish pink color. And I can go back to the color balance and even adjust this a little bit more here. There we go, something like that. And we can also add other things like a brightness and contrast, and you can also add in a curves, just different options of ways you can tweak the color and the brightness. But there's another way you can actually change the color of something, and I'm going to demonstrate this on the second star. So this is the original image straight from the download. And it's two different colors. So I liked the look of the star, but I didn't want that gray color in there. But let's say we want it to be completely red and we want it to look something more like our first star. Well, this is actually pretty easy. The first thing we need to do is come to the strip tab and down where it says color, open that up and then bring down the saturation all the way. And that's just going to make everything grayscale. Then all we have to do is add in a color and move it to the top. And then we're going to change the blend mode from alpha over to multiply. And that does exactly what I want it to do, except it does it for the entire image. So it is multiplying it over everything else. Not only do we not want that, but we also want to add in a drop shadow. And this is going to be difficult to do in our main scene. So instead, let's make a completely new scene just for this one star. So I'm just going to come up here to Scene, click this button for a new scene, and choose Copy Settings. And then I'm actually going to change the output settings to match our image. So let's go back to the beginning of our timeline and add in our star again. And in our properties, let's go to the Strip tab, Transform, and you can see it's scaled it up a little bit, so let's change our scale back down to 1. This is the original size of our image. And to find out the actual dimensions of the image, we can come down here to Source, and where it says Resolution, you can see it says 640 by 609. So I'm just going to change the resolution of our scene to match that image. And now you can see we have our star. So now let's move the star strip up. Add in our color, just like we did before, right over the top of our star. Change the color to a bright red color, and then change the blend mode to multiply. Perfect, and now we can go to our rendering workspace, press F12, and now we can save out this image. So navigate to your folder, but before we actually save it, make sure the file format is PNG, and then RGBA. A is for alpha, which is the transparency, and then we can save our image. So this is good for our image, but I want to make a drop shadow on this, just like we did with our text. So come back to the video editing workspace. We're going to do the same exact thing, duplicate our star, go down to color, bring the saturation all the way down, and bring the multiply up to something like 5. So now it is a solid white color, but we want the inverse of this, we want a black color. So go to modifiers, add strip modifier, and actually we can do it up here, of course, so we have more room. So add strip modifier curves, and we're just going to invert these 2 points here, bringing the top one over to the left and the bottom one over to the right. And actually that doesn't look all that good. We still have these weird artifacts on the edges. So let's adjust this a little bit more, and we can actually bring the bottom one back over to the left, and then the top one just slightly to the right of that. There we go. So now everything is all black. So here's the black shadow, but of course we need to add a Gaussian blur onto this and then hide the bottom star. So we just see our blur, select the Gaussian blur, and then make this a size of 20. Now again, I'm going quickly over this because we've already done this step by step. With our text, I'm just doing the exact same thing. So we can take the Gaussian blur and move that around a little bit off to the side. And then our shadow is cut off with our resolution, so I'm just going to widen our resolution a little bit. And then we can mess with the opacity. And then let's go back to our rendering. Open up our image tab, select slot 2, and press F12. And that way we can go back and forth with slot 1 and slot 2 to see with and without the shadow. So let's go ahead and save this image out as red star 2 underscore shadow. And of course we got to change PNG and then RGBA, save image. And so we don't have to keep doing that every time we save out an image. We can come to the output properties and then change it down here. File format PNG and color RGBA. And now when we go to save it out, it will automatically pull that information over here. All right, so let's go back to our main scene, and we can now add in our newly created image, a red star. Ta-da! It looks just like this. And I'm actually going to delete the other star because I want to keep this one. And we can put it here, but I do think that the shadow is a little bit too prominent. So we can easily go back, just change that. I'm going to add in a red background to emulate what we have in our main scene, just so we can see the shadow a little bit better. I'm going to bring the blur up to maybe 40, bring down the opacity to 0.3. Yeah, I think that looks good there. So hide the background, go back to rendering, go to slot 3, and press F12, and then I'm going to just rename this red star 2 underscore shadow 2, and we already have it as PNG RGBA, which is good, so save image. Let's go back to our main scene and delete this one and add in our newly created one. And let's position it where we want it, and we can do some color grading on this one as well. So just add in a color balance and adjust those colors to match our scene a little bit better. So there you go. That is how you add images and adjust them to fit the colors and theme of your project. So now we've added images that other people have made, downloaded from the internet. I'm going to show you how to make your own simple shapes in Blender. Now the VSE doesn't actually do this at all. The only shape that it has if you add in a color is just the size of whatever resolution you have. And so just squares and rectangles. But I'm going to show you how to make custom shapes by using masks. So go to the masking workspace, and I'm going to say mask triangle because I'm going to make a little Christmas tree right over on the side over here. And we're going to do 3 triangles and put them right here like a tree. So go back to masking, press F12 so we can render out what we have. So we want to make a triangle, but we only have 2 preset masks that we can add. So I'm just going to choose square and then bring this over here, rotate this, pressing R and then typing 45, enter, and then select the bottom point and X to delete and choose delete. And now we have a triangle. And then we can come up to mask display and choose overlay so we can see what it's going to look like. So everywhere there is white, it's going to show, and everywhere it's black, it's going to be invisible. So then coming back over to our video editing, all we have to do is add in a color, change this to a green, and then go to the modifiers tab, add in a strip modifier, choose mask, click mask, and then choose our mask triangle. And so the green color will only be shown where our mask triangle is showing. You can see if I move my mask around the scene, I can control R to refresh, and you can see the triangle moves around the scene. But this is a little tedious, especially when it comes to animation. So instead, what we're going to do is make our shape using a completely different scene, just like we did with our red star. So I'm actually going to go to our star because we're going to use this setting, and then I'm going to click this button for new scene and copy settings. So going back to our video editing, let's go to the first frame, add in a color, go to modifiers, and strip modifier and choose our mask triangle, which is all the way over here on the right side because it's relative to what we had in our main scene. It's just now the resolution has been scaled down. So going back to our masking, we can adjust this by, I'm just going to delete that whole thing. We're going to add in another one. Make sure our 2D cursor is directly in the center at 0.5 on the X and the Y. Then we add in our square, type R, and then 4, 5 to rotate it 45 degrees. Select the bottom point, X to delete. Now we have our triangle. Let's just go ahead and press S to scale that up to fit our resolution. You can't see my screencast keys for some reason now, so press N on the keyboard to open up the properties. Go to the strip tab, and then we can change our color to a green color. I'm just going to make it a straight green because once we add it to our main scene, we can always change that to match. So now we can render this out. Go to rendering, press F12, and now we have our green triangle. And we have our checkerboard texture, which is our transparent background. And I actually forgot to rename our scene. So this is not a star, this is triangle. So I'm going to rename that here, triangle. And when you rename the scene, you lose your render. So we have to press F12 again. And then I'm going to save the image as. Now I've already done this before, so I'm just going to save this as my triangle green. And I actually saved over the one I had previously, which I didn't mean to do, but it's okay. Just make sure you're not saving over anything accidentally that you've already created. And now it's time for our drop shadow. Duplicate the triangle down, change it to black, move it down so we can fit our Gaussian blur, and then add in a Gaussian blur, hide the bottom color. I'm going to hide the top color too so we can see our blur, change the size of the blur to 20. So to see what this looks like, I'm going to add in our red color on the bottom temporarily. And that's actually a pretty good drop shadow for what we're going to use it for. So let's move this red background up. I'm going to hide that. Go to rendering, choose our next slot, which apparently is slot 4, and then F12 to render. I'm going to save this as triangle green shadow 2 this time so that I don't save it over the other one that I have. And now we can come back to our scene. Okay, this is this is using that mask again, so we're just going to delete that and add in our triangle with our drop shadow. And the reason I created two, one without the shadow and one with the shadow, is that in case we wanted to have more control over the drop shadow in our main scene, we could always add in the one without the drop shadow and create our own manually. But let's move this over here. And I'm going to add in a hue correct to match it a little bit better with our scene, make it a little bit darker. That looks all right. Okay, so now we can just duplicate this a couple of times to make the rest of the tree. And just grab the middle one, move that down a little bit, and then grab the bottom one, move that down a little bit. And then we can just scale the bottom one up a little bit and scale the middle one up a little bit. And there we go. We now have our little Christmas tree. And if we wanted to add in a trunk, we can do that very easily by just adding a color because it's just going to be a rectangle shape. And we just scale it on the X and the Y. Of course, we got to put the color on the bottom so it's behind the rest of the tree. And then we can change that color to a dark brown for a tree trunk color. And by the way, the reason I'm doing it like this instead of creating the whole tree in our triangle scene or a tree scene is because I want to actually animate each of the pieces of the tree coming in later on, and we'll do that in a little bit. So that is how you make your own shapes using masks, and you can even play around with the points to make all sorts of different types of shapes. So something like this, we can create our star by moving around the points. If you change V, you can change the handle type and move the handles around to make all sorts of different fun shapes. And in fact, we are going to make one more custom shape. Instead of making a whole new scene, I'm just going to make it on our triangle scene. I'm going to add a new mask and name this mask Sparkle. This time we're going to add in a circle. I'm going to scale it up all the way to the edges of our resolution, but I don't want a full circle filled in. I just want a ring. So I'm going to uncheck Fill in our mask tab. And then we can change the size of our ring by pressing Alt S, and that just scales that feather. Of course, that's a feather, and so it kind of fades out, and you can kind of see that if I just scale the whole thing down to fit our resolution, make it a little bit thicker, like this. But the edges are a bit soft, so we can change our fall off to sphere, and that makes it a little bit harder of an edge. And then I'm going to select all the points by pressing A, press V, and then choose free for our handle type. Take each of these points and move them. So the top 2 points, I'm going to press G, Y, and minus 0.2 to bring this down 0.2. Now this number is working for me depending on your resolution and your image. The number could be different. Just play around with different numbers, different distances. And actually I'm going to do 0.3 instead. I'm going to do this for the other one as well. And then on the bottom, we do the same thing, but instead of negative, it's positive. So G, Y, 0.3 for both of these. And then we're going to do the same thing for the sides. So this time, select the handle, G, and then X minus 0.3, and the same thing with the other one, and GX plus 0.3 for this side. And Alt S to scale that feather to make it a little bit more thin. And now you can see the shape we are going for. So this is like a little sparkle we can make. And I'm actually going to change these handles even more. I'm just going to bring them all inward 0.1. So altogether they've moved 0.4 in their respective directions. And you can actually select multiple handles by shift selecting the handles so that you can move 2 at the same time. All right, that's pretty good. I'm also going to check self-intersect, and that's going to get rid of these little artifacts here where they overlap, and that just makes it look a little bit cleaner. Okay, so now we need to use this mask over here on this color. So select our color strip, go to modifiers, add strip modifier, mask, click mask, and then choose our mask sparkle. All right, so let's go to our rendering tab, go to slot 1, or whichever slot you want it. Press F12, image, save as. I will save this as sparkle. Again, PNG, RGBA. And now let's go back to our scene, add in our sparkle image, bring that all the way to the top, and we can scale it down and move it to where we want so it looks something like this. And actually, you know what? We can actually make this a little bit more prominent. Let's scale it up a little bit first. And in order to do this, all we have to do is come down to the color on the strip tab and change the multiply to something greater. I'm just going to put 2, and that gets rid of the faded edges. So let's scale that back down, and we'll put it into position something like this. Okay, so that's how you use Blender to add all of those things to your video sequence editor scene. And now it's time for animation, so that's what we'll do in the next video. You can find this video and a whole lot more by going to my new website, blenderfrenzy.com, where you can access lots of free and members-only content, including extra tutorials, downloads, assets, blend files, Q&A live streams, and much more. Signing up helps support me, which in turn gives you more Blender content, so head on over to blenderfrenzy.com and become a member today.